Hey everyone, thanks for taking time to join Stan, McChrystal, and myself here for another episode of No Turning Back. Today we have the real unique privilege and honor of spending time with Michle Flournoy. For those of you that have served in the government, maybe you're still currently in government service, you'll recognize the name. For those that don't know the name, trust me when I say that Michle Flournoy is one of the most thoughtful, interesting, and proven leaders inside of U.S. government. She has held multiple positions inside the Pentagon, all the way up to serving as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, a position that she filled after years of prior service inside of Department of Defense. While there and beyond, she was just known as a thoughtful, hardworking, dedicated civil servant who also, frankly, is quite brilliant in her understanding of global policy, and her coupled with a very focused ability to form teams, lead others, all the human qualities that we know great leaders need to embody and learn throughout their careers. I think what's most unique about Michelle, and you'll hear her talk about this during this episode, is how deliberate she's been about that side of leadership. Growing up in a space where you need the requisite sort of focus, dedication, hard work, intelligence, all those things. She's also known from early in her career, which she talks about here with Stan and I, that leadership was also a key component if you hope to scale. Just working hard and being smart is not enough in that space, as in most spaces where real leaders are required and move to the top. So it's just fantastic to hear her perspective on those ideas, especially because she's led at senior levels, both in the government and in the private space and in the think tank world as well. And additionally, she's created her own organization, not once but twice, created her own think tank, co-founded, and created her own advisory firm where she is right now, WestExec, based in D.C. So just a plethora of experiences as a leader and an ability to describe them and articulate the role of the leader in a way that few others can. So I think you'll really enjoy this episode. And again, Stan and I want to thank Michelle for taking the time. Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time. You're one of the busier people in DC these days to spend a few minutes here with Stan, McChrystal, and myself. To start things off, could you just walk us through the last few years of your career and how you got to the position you are, some of the time you spent in government, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, it's great. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be able to talk to both of you about one of our, I think, shared favorite topics, which is leadership. So, as you know, I served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2012, which was, one of my peak life experiences, just a chance to advise then Secretary Gates and then Secretary Panetta on everything from national strategy to oversight of military plans and operations to, representing them in the National Security Council process and in international defense diplomacy. So it was an amazing experience, and also running a very large organization and overseeing 3 of the defense agencies. So fantastic experience. When I left, I ended up spending some time in the private sector. One of the impressions I left the Pentagon with was how broken it was as a business enterprise. So I set about trying to figure out what does good look like in business. And so I joined Boston Consulting Group for a few years to really get a lot of different case study experiences of, what best practice in business looks like. And then I ended up being called back to my old think tank, the one I had co-founded, CNAS, Center for New American Security, to do a second leadership stint as CEO. And then after the 2016 elections, which went a different way than I had personally hoped, I decided I was ready for a new challenge, and I thought I would take the entrepreneurial experience I had from CNAS and the business experience I got at BCG and some sitting on boards, and start my own business. So we started WestExec Advisors, which is a relatively new, 3 years old, strategic advisory firm in DC, which advises U.S. companies on managing different kinds of geopolitical risk around the world. So it's been a great journey, and I've been very blessed to have lots of different opportunities to continue to really enjoy the work and also build organizations.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Michèle, and thanks for being here. You, Chris, and I have been having a conversation about leadership for more than a decade now.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, it's frightening, isn't it? And what I want to do is answer people who listen to this question about what's it like to be in the room when a really big decision is being made. And I'll take you back to the summer of 2009, and I was commanding forces in Afghanistan, and you and I and Secretary Gates and Dave Rodriguez and some others met at an airfield in France. I think it was France. And we met at in this small building to go through a recommendation for operations in Afghanistan that were going to do two things. They were going to be politically difficult to decide, but they were also going to affect people's lives. They were going to be people's whose welfare and well-being were going to be impacted. And I remember in the moment being with that small group and looking around the room and realizing we are doing historically significant decision-making here. You've been in many more venues like that than I have. What's it like? What does it feel like to make decisions that have that kind of impact?
Well, first of all, I think when the decisions involve putting Americans in harm's way, you feel the weight of the decision. And, I always start with, a set of almost like a checklist in my mind, which is first, have we given the decision maker, in this case, it was Secretary Gates, eventually it would become President Obama, have we given that decision maker a really clear-eyed assessment of the situation? What we know, what we don't know, what we're unsure about, but no color, candy coating it, no wishful thinking, but no kidding, clear-eyed assessment of what the ground truth is. Secondly, do we have a real sense of strategy? Do we know what we're trying to achieve? Are the objectives clear? Are they realistic? And is the theory of the case, if you will, how do we actually win or succeed, clear? And then third, have we presented all the options that should be considered? And here, I think one of the most important things that I learned is the incredible value of both kind of orthogonal thinking, diversity of thinking around the table, to have people come at the problem from different perspectives and say, hey, what about this or what about that, before you kind of get to a sort of group consensus, but also dissent. And this is something that I felt that Secretary Gates did very well and President Obama did very well, where they created an environment where if everybody seemed to be agreeing on something and you thought, no, I'm not comfortable with this, even if you were the junior person in the room, you felt empowered and even obligated to speak up and say, no, we haven't thought about this the right way, or what about this, or what about that? So that is very, very important. I think the one thing that I learned in retrospect, one of many things, is I wish we had given history more of a seat at the table. So had I to do this again, I would have asked the question, under what conditions has counterinsurgency succeeded and not succeeded? And how do we assess the Afghan situation relative to those historical cases? Because I think we went in believing that we had a different kind of partner in the Afghan government than we actually did. And I think that was a sort of critical vulnerability in the approach in hindsight. But I think history, had you had like a historian at the table, maybe we would have sort of talked that through or had that insight. And I don't think I can speak for myself. I didn't have that insight until we were in the middle of it, learning the hard way.
Can I tease that out a bit? Because it's a great point. All of us come from action-oriented backgrounds in the military, government, in the private sector. have you learned any lessons on that point over the years of striking the balance between focus, next step, action plan, etc., and pushing back from the table and saying, hold on, let's think about this just for a bit from that different lens? Because I know I've certainly been guilty of getting frustrated with that person that always takes it up to the 50,000 foot level when it's time to get things done. And it's easy to default to the action versus, to your point, occasionally stepping back and saying, let's give history a seat at the table. What else are we missing here?
Yeah, I think, you can risk being stuck in deliberation and feeling like you never have enough information to make a decision. And the truth is, particularly in the national security domain, and a lot of times in business, by definition, you're making decisions, big decisions, with imperfect or incomplete information. So for me, in that instance, it's really important to put in place some way of monitoring the actual execution and getting the data, to keep checking your math, to get the indicators. Is this working or is it not? And if you're starting to get indicators that there's something that's awry, really take a hard look at that and saying, is this just, it's just going to take a little more time, or we're not doing the execution quite right? Or is this telling me that my basic strategy is problematic and is not going to work here? So I think that having not just make a decision and walk away, but really following through in the execution to continue that evaluation process. And we did this in Afghanistan. We had, much to Stan's joy, we had regular strategy reviews of how things were going. But I think the other thing that I watched is people get very attached. The more they put into something, the greater the sunk costs, the more they cling to a course of action. And one of the first things you learn in business school is do not make decisions based on sunk costs. And I think that is, but it's really, really hard, particularly in a case where, you've put real people's lives on the line. There's serious sacrifices that have been made. To take new information and change that strategy is a very difficult decision, but I think the best decision makers do make those adjustments.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's really hard to do, because you remember there were 3 reviews of Afghanistan even before I took over in that year, 2008 to 2009. And every time it came down to we could do more, we could do less, or we could do about the same. More was problematic because it was politically difficult. Less probably meant that Afghanistan would fall, and then the idea of an al-Qaeda haven. And so we ended up sort of in the middle. And if you read back on Vietnam, that's the same tune that got played. And I think we were guilty, and I completely agree with you, of sort of narrowing our decision down a bit to say, do we need to do this particular strategy? And we probably should have gotten to the 50,000 foot level and asked sort of big historical questions. Yeah. Is it possible to roll this rock uphill? Yeah. And I wanted to drill in on something specific you said, though, when you talked about being the junior person in the room, maybe voicing dissent. I'm going to put the other side. If you're the senior person in the room, how do you either create that environment or that expectation for junior people to feel like they can and should speak up?
It's a great question, and it's something that I watched you do actually really well. I remember one battlefield circulation we did together where you brought all the junior folks to, you sort of dismissed the leaders, much to their chagrin, and brought the enlisted folks and the junior leaders together, and you sat them down and you for a listening session, and I think you asked them something along the lines of, if there's one thing you could change, have us do better. If I told you had to stay here until we win, and there's one thing you would change so that we could win and go home, what would it be? Something along those lines. And you got amazing input from these young folks. So you created that safe space where, they could tell you what they really thought from a ground level truth without, upsetting their chain of command or what have you. And that was really, impressed me. But I think I found that, number one, you actually have to be careful not to indicate your own preference too quickly, because in a hierarchical kind of culture with a strong sense of, command and control, you can shut down debate unintentionally before it even starts, just by expressing a view or an opinion. And the second is, do not shoot the messenger. I mean, like if somebody comes up with a wacky idea or, something you don't like, and you just like cut them off at the knees, nobody's going to speak up again. So you have to create an environment, and I think actively soliciting. Obama used to go literally around not only the table, but the room. And I had this very bad habit of scowling when I concentrate or read. And so I would always look like I was disagreeing or like in consternation. And so he would call on me, and Secretary Gates would kind of look behind him like, what's your problem? But he would literally pull dissenting opinions out of people, even the most junior people not at the table. And I thought that created a climate where everybody pretty much felt safe to say, I don't think I agree. I'm worried that we're missing this or that, which helped him make better decisions.
I agree.
In the leadership seminar that Stan and I have been teaching up at the Jackson Institute at Yale for about 5 years together, Stan's been there for about 10. One of the pieces that we'll often use is what you wrote at BCG, amongst other things, the first 100 days. I don't know how well you remember that, but it's still, we get asked that all the time. I've taken over a new job. What should I be thinking about? And that's top of my sort of documents list that I'll send it to people all the time. To run through very quickly the top principles you lay out in there. And I'd love to bounce them off you and ask, the question is, have you seen differences between, because this was written specific for government, do you see difference between that and the corporate space, or has your thinking here evolved at all over the last decade since you wrote that? And they were: arrive at the plan, know your ecosystem, assemble your team quickly, set and drive your agenda with consistency, focus on culture, and then over communicate. Those are sort of the 6 big drivers, and there's a lot underneath those. Any thoughts that have changed over the years or differences between those 2 different spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those lessons were derived from private sector cases and then adapted to what would work in government. So I think there's a lot of that works in both contexts. I think you have, in my experience, a lot more freedom of action in the private sector. One of the aspects of government that's so difficult and frustrating is just the number and types of constraints. There's legal constraints, policy constraints, regulatory constraints, very ingrained habits of working. And so in my private sector experience, I've had the luxury twice now with CNAS and WestExec of having a totally clean sheet of paper and saying, what kind of culture do I want to create? And that is just so much fun and such a creative, wonderful process. And there are no obstacles. There's nothing to overcome. There are no constraints. You can just literally create the organization that you want it to be. Whereas in government, it's a lot more of I'm walking into this very constrained position, and how do I maneuver and get the behavior to change even in the context of constraints that I can't change. And so one of my key insights from the private sector that I think is very applicable in government is, when we're trying to change things in government, too often we focus on reorganizing the deck chairs. Let's redraw the organizational chart, which to me often has limited impact. Sometimes it's necessary, but I found much more powerful was this notion of, if I'm going to try to change behavior, how do I realign the whole incentive structure with what I'm trying to do? And it may be, how people are evaluated, what they're held accountable for, how they get promoted, how they win recognition. But you've got to sort of, if you want people to behave differently, you've got to realign the incentives to that behavior. And I had some very simple but powerful experiences of that in government, that, even within a constrained environment, you can change culture and behavior if you really focus on that alignment piece.
Michèle, I got to watch you come in as the undersecretary. Now, you'd already been in the Pentagon before, but I was director of the Joint Staff, and you came in as the Undersecretary for Policy, and you were very effective, even though there were a tremendous number of, as you say, guardrail sort of constraints that limit you. I'm going to ask you to drill down a little bit more about that time, early 2009, and the things that you felt you could and couldn't do, because many of our listeners have never been in either a big bureaucracy or a federal agency.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate to have a lot of clarity on my role and my decision rights, if you will, from Secretary Gates. So I definitely knew what my job was. I knew what my lane was. I knew what I could decide, what I had to bring to him, what he wanted me to deliver, and what I was going to be held accountable for. So that was extremely helpful. So I took that, and then as I assembled my team, we did a series of offsites to align on a vision for where we're trying to go, not only in policy terms, but as an organization. Really define a set of objectives and who's going to be responsible for what. And then we did a real focused effort on how we were going to work together and how we were going to develop our people. Because I came in, had an outside group do an assessment of our workforce when I came in the door. And they benchmarked them against all kinds of other organizations. They said they had never seen a more mission-focused organization or group of people, and they had never seen a more exhausted and demoralized group of people. And so the good news is people were really committed. They were there for the right reason, but they were just totally burnt out after years and years of sort of warlike tempo in the Pentagon, wartime tempo. And so we really started a big investment strategy. And I found that this is where I really learned in practice what, all the literature says, which is if you want to get improved performance in your organization, start by investing in your people. And hold your leaders accountable. I actually removed DASs and assistant secretaries because they couldn't do the human capital, the leadership part of their jobs, even though they could do the policy part, which is very rare. Political appointees don't usually, too often, unfortunately, they don't pay attention to that. They're there to do the policy, and they don't necessarily try to improve the health of the organization while they're there. But it worked so powerfully that I remember sitting in Secretary Gates's office and him putting down a memo that he was reading. He's like, "Did you fire everybody there and hire a new staff?" I was like, "No, we just have spent 6 months investing in them." And he's like, "Wow, this is like a different organization in terms of the quality of work he was getting." So I became a true believer in making that investment right up front.
Yeah, let me add on that because I got to watch that. And as you say, there's a perception sometimes that federal employees are lazy or bureaucratic or don't care. I would argue they care so much, and it's the tension, the stress caused by caring a lot, by having so many constraints, working all week to get a single briefing approved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of the motivating the workforce is, as a leader, your job is to go be a bureaucracy buster for your people and to go after those constraints. So one of the things that I thought I was doing just kind of for fun and to set a tone, but it ended up being wildly powerful, was we had a contest at the beginning. I said, okay, top 10 stupid bureaucratic things that are wasting your time that we should stop doing right now. And we got something like, I don't know, several hundred nominations. And I found that just under my own authority, I could deal with 70 or 75 of them, with the stroke of a pen. We're just not going to do that anymore. And that was oh my God, it was like the drought-stricken plant getting watered for the first time. It was oh my God, this is great. But it set the tone, and then it also incented people hey, if you have an idea of how we should work better together, have at it. Let's speak up. And I remember people telling me, "Oh, well, it's DOD directive and DOD policy." And I was like, "Well, that's easy. My boss signs those documents. What do we need to try to change?" It's not always easy, but it is. I think you really have to have that top cover and that leadership to really go after removing the obstacles to success for your staff.
That's funny. I'm thinking of a time when I was Stan McChrystal's aide over in Iraq, and we got into some helicopter, and somebody didn't have the right seatbelt or something, and the pilot told me he couldn't take off because it was against the commanding general's authorization approvals or whatever. I said, well, yeah, I'll just put on my headset. I think he can override it. We made his day. Can you talk a little bit? You came up in a culture and a space inside the government where, I'm not biased by having watched it, but smart people do really well, right? You need to be really focused, very hardworking, and pretty bright to reach those echelons. At what point did you recognize that you also had to be a leader of people? Was that early on?
Actually, that was in my first Pentagon tour. So, I had spent, probably 10 years in the think tank world. And one of my former mentors was going into the Clinton administration, and I got the great advice, choose the boss, not the job. So I went in with him, and he said, well, great, I'm going to make you an office director. I'm like, okay. And, I had run projects and teams before, but I now had 25 people. Some of them were career civilians, some of them were political appointees, some of them were military officers, including like a post-command Navy captain, like a seriously experienced military leader. And I had a DAS who was a brilliant thinker, but did not have a lot of interest in management. So I really kind of had the lead on managing this motley group of people. And it was a brand new office. So we had no standing. We were also trying to kind of create our space and our contribution. So that was really the moment where I realized that it's really not just about being a good or an excellent, individual performer. It is about getting the most out of your people. And some of them may be those stellar performers, and some of them may be okay, but not, the best in the world. But your job is still to figure out what are they really good at and where can they contribute and how do I enable that. And I must say, a certain amount of humility is required. Like this post-command Navy captain came up to me and he said, you've said this is your first management job. You have really good instincts, but and I've spent, 30 something years doing this. I would be honored to, if you would, as well as being your staff, if you would also want me to do some mentoring and coaching with you and give you feedback on how I think, and how your approach is being received. And unfortunately, I was so, I think, daunted by the task that I said, absolutely. There was no problem accepting that offer. And that really, really helped me, to basically have someone who was technically a subordinate, but I could see had such value to add to the organization in terms of guidance on leadership and how to do it, especially in the Pentagon. So anyway, I think it took a certain amount of humility to like put your ego aside and say, yes, I'm going to learn from someone who works for me and has a lot more experience in this area. But that was really my crucible, and it was fantastic. It was a wonderful experience.
Michèle, you've had experience now in the public sector and the private sector, which is sort of building not only your resume, but your whole basis of attitude and thought on leadership. I'm interested how you think you've changed as a leader now that you've had this latest time out in the private sector. How do you view it differently, and how can we shape leaders for both that get a melding of the qualities of each?
That's a great question. So I think it's been really helpful for me to get some experience understanding how business works, whether it was through BCG or sitting on boards or now consulting to companies, because, in the national security enterprise, there's a huge reliance of the government on industry to, whether it's providing equipment or services or technical experience or expertise. And if you have people in government who really haven't a clue about how business works, it's a problem in terms of being a good customer, having strong oversight, knowing how to get accountability out when you're spending taxpayer dollars. So I think it's really important to have people who have this cross-sector experience and who understand the language of both and who can translate, what government needs into terms that a business can understand. And so for me, that it's been, it's sort of been like growing a different side of your brain. But I also think that the private sector, as I mentioned, offers you more of a clean slate, more agency to make change. And so, for example, I remember just fighting tooth and nail, when I was undersecretary to try to get the system to give me more diverse slates of qualified candidates. And you'd have to send it back, look harder, go here, go there. It was just so hard. And, in this moment, one of the things WestExec has decided to do is partner with a group that's focused on bringing diversity to the national security sector and use our senior folks to mentor their junior folks and start enriching the pipeline of people who are ready to serve either on the business side or the public sector side. So that program that we created in a week, would have taken a year of paperwork and authorizations and fighting the system to put something like that in place. So I think that the experience, being able to have a more entrepreneurial experience, I think, and sort of exercise those muscles is very good to bring into government. Even though it's more constrained and it's harder, you still have to be an entrepreneur inside government if you're really going to make change and make it better.
Yeah, it's a great way to frame it. I'm assuming you've had more calls than you can remember, people transitioning out of government into the private sector and sort of seeking your advice, your experiences, et cetera. Do you have sort of a standard set of principles that you share with folks as they're getting out of either many years in civilian side of government or coming out of uniform over to the private sector?
One of the things I say is take some time. You're more exhausted than likely. And, get some rest and get some perspective. Don't rush to the first thing that's offered. Secondly, be the kid in the candy store, particularly for people who've had 20 plus years in the military or 20 plus years as a civil servant. You've had a career, but you're still often coming out when you're young enough to have another career. And, you're not ready to retire. And you could do anything, literally open up in a way that you probably haven't thought about since you were in college or maybe earlier, to really think about, what do I love doing? Is there something I want to learn? Is there something I want to accomplish? And give yourself permission to be, just fully explore the space of possibilities. And then I also usually say, be willing to take some risk. I mean, part of what led to CNAS and WestExec is, if I looked around and didn't find something I was jumping up and down excited about, I was like, okay, I'm going to create the thing that I'm going to be excited about. And I'm going to do it the way that will, get me, jazzed to get up in the morning. So don't be afraid to also look to create something as you two have with the McChrystal group, and something that's really unique and distinctive in its approach. And then the last thing I always say is, one of the last things is choose the people, choose the boss and the team. And that is going to probably dictate 90% of your experience and your happiness, no matter what the job description looks like or what the particulars are. That the perfect job with a bad boss or the wrong team is not going to make you happy. But, put yourself with a group of people you love and share the right values and culture and work ethic. And, you will figure out how to make a contribution and really enjoy it in the process. So,
Michèle, you've already in your conversation today touched a lot of things that really add up to mentoring for somebody sort of entering a career now. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to ask you how you think about mentoring in terms of people who are just starting out and they want to go in a certain direction. How formal should it be? How engaged should it be? How should a young person find a mentor? And that sort of thing.
So it's a great question. I personally think mentoring is one of the most important things we all can do. I mean, frankly, when you work in the world of policy, you realize how ephemeral it is. You make progress and then it gets reversed or changed. But when you invest in another human being and you help them along their journey, that nobody can take that away from you. That is impact, and that is enduring, and it has multiples over time as that person goes on to make different contributions. And I think you're never too young. I mean, I've told, when my son came out of one of the service academies, I'm just like, somebody else is trying to get in to that academy. You can already start mentoring, someone who's applying and who's trying to figure out what you figured out, and we're able to, enjoy this opportunity. But I think most of my mentoring has come very organically out of, someone working with people or meeting them or being put together with them on a project. And the relationship has sort of organically grown. But I must say that in the last couple of years, I've tried to get more deliberate about who I mentor. So I mentioned, this formal mentoring program that we started with the Diversity and National Security Network, which focuses on bringing mid and senior career people of color into the national space or advancing their careers. A lot of my work has been over the years has focused on women, because when I was in the Clinton administration, we had a women's leadership lunch, and all 8 of us sat at one table in the Pentagon, and everybody was like freaked out, like, why are all the women, all 8 of them, sitting together? What are they talking about? And I'm happy to, and the women I hired as presidential management interns 25 years ago are now ready to be, sub-cabinet or, deputy secretaries and service secretaries and real leaders. It takes time to, grow that pipeline. But I think if you see a gap, the importance is not to do a sort of mini-me culture, particularly for men, I think, to say, oh, he reminds me of my younger self, so I'm going to mentor someone who looks just like me. But to say, actually, let me look at the cadre and the pipeline and what kind of talent we need to be leveraging as a nation. And if I see gaps, how can I proactively go out there and help start to fill those gaps?
That's great. Let me, if I could, follow up, because now I'm getting a little bit personal. And as you get senior, you suddenly find out that not everybody out there gets up in the morning wishing you well. Oh, yeah. And for lots of reasons, they throw rocks, they shoot arrows, they do everything. And they don't just hit you, they hit your family, they hit your friends, they do all of those things. How do you process that, Michèle? How do you prepare for that? How do you repair from that when it happens?
So I think you have to be, if you're going to be in the arena, you have to be prepared to be hit. And so you do have to develop that resilience. A lot of it feels unfair. It feels like you're being mischaracterized or misunderstood, or, and so forth. And so I think you have to develop a thick skin. You have to sort of understand it comes with the territory. And if it really, really bothers you and you can't sort of find a way to cope with it, you should probably ask whether you belong in the public sphere, in the public sector, or the arena. I must say, I've only had a few times, really once, that I can think of, where someone came after my family, and I did not. I mean, it was very upsetting, and that is much more difficult to take than having people. They can shoot at me all day, but they start casting aspersions on my family, and that is really tough. And I think that, fortunately, appointed policy people don't get too much of that. I think politicians get a lot more of that. But that, I think that's just much tougher. And I understand why people sort of react strongly sometimes and emotionally when that happens. And I wish we were in a world where that was sort of seen by the press and others as off limits, that we don't go after children, we don't go after spouses and so forth.
Exactly.
Michèle, also a little bit on the
personal side, just you as a leader, what you've learned over the years. I've seen a through line in great leaders across industry, military, civilian, government sector, of just personal discipline and how they approach their day, how they take care of themselves, mind, body, spirit. How no two are the same, but there's always some underlying core sort of first principles. How have you've lived in these spaces where you're working 19 hours a day, 7 days a week for extended periods? What tricks have you learned along the way? How do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, there is no balance when you are, in command in Afghanistan, or, in, a direct report to the secretary and responsive to the NSC. So, talking about work-life balance is a little, it doesn't really exist in that period, but there are things you have to do to survive, not only survive, but to be mentally where you need to be to do the job well. And I used to say to my staff, we are running a marathon, not a sprint. There will be intervals, but we got to run faster for a while, but we are pacing ourselves generally when we can, we're pacing ourselves for the marathon. And I was very fortunate to have a boss like Robert Gates, who was also pacing himself. And unless there was a national emergency or a meeting with the president, he walked out the door at a certain time every night so that his staff could walk out the door. For me, I've learned that I am a person who has to work out. I don't work out like Stan or like you, but in my own version of working out, I work out, or else I'm a very a grumpy person that nobody likes to be around. So I got to do that. I need a certain amount of sleep. I kind of know how many hours, and below that, if it's too consistent, I start losing my edge. And I find that for me, some quiet time each day, whether it's for meditation or reading or just reflection, that is really, really important, where you just stop and you sort of go inward. So those are some of the things. And then family time. I'm fortunate to have a beautiful family and a husband I love, and I actually want to see them on occasion. And when I do, that's a huge way to fill up the tank. And so that is different things. And what I used to say to my staff is, we're all working crazy hours, but we're going to try to give each other predictable time off and cross cover to allow for that. And you need to figure out what those things are for you. And for somebody, it's like, I want to train for a marathon. For somebody else, I need to regularly, every other Friday, see my, parent who's not well, or take my child to the doctor, or whatever it is. But you figure out what are those things that you've got to have to keep going in these jobs. And then asking teams to cross cover to deliver that for each other. And that was a lot of the secret of how we paced for the marathon, in the policy office in OSD.
Michèle, I'm going to finish by thanking you for taking the time with us, but also by asking a very direct, final, very personal question. I entered the Army when I was young because my father had been in the Army and my brothers were in the Army. It just seemed like a good idea. And I think I was halfway through my career when I ever asked myself, why am I doing this? And you've just described a life that is enriched in many ways, but it's hard. So, Michle Flournoy, why? How do you do it?
I have always been drawn to service. I had the example of my dad, who was not a career military officer, but served nobly in World War II and did his part. Never talked about it, but served. I married someone who spent, 26 years in service, active in reserve. I feel that I have been very fortunate, in my life, with incredible education, wonderful mentors. I've always felt the sense of, how are you going to leave the world a better place? How are you going to give back? And I've always been drawn to things international and national security, whether it was being an exchange student in high school or, coming of age when we were in the middle of nuclear saber rattling between the US and the Soviet Union and feeling like, oh my goodness, if we don't figure out how to reduce the nuclear danger, we're not going to be around to do anything else. And that's really the issue that drew me into this field in the first place. But I have always felt that, service is a privilege. And, any chance that I can do it from inside government or from outside in some small way, maybe through mentoring or maybe through helping someone else along, it's a privilege. And it gets me up every morning with a smile on my face, even in the crazy times that we're in. So.
Well, it's been a privilege knowing you for so long, and it's been a privilege to be here this afternoon with you because this is amazing. Chris, let me pass it to you.
Michèle, can't thank you enough for taking the time and just a great discussion. And we wish you the
thanks
best
to
of
you
luck.
all. I learned a lot working with you and watching you, and also going through your leadership course when you were piloting it. So, I enjoy our conversation about these topics and hope to continue it in the future. So thanks for having me on.